Russia is building a new network of bases for launching long-range drones, and some of them are already within striking distance of NATO countries. New technologies allow Russian drones to fly significantly further, faster, and carry more explosives, which means NATO territory is also potentially under threat. So what exactly is Russia building near the alliance's borders? How far can the new Gerans drones fly? And is Moscow really preparing to take its drone war beyond the borders of Ukraine? Let's break it down. The Telegraph analyzed satellite imagery and documents and discovered at least 59 new launch rails along the Russian border with Belarus and Ukraine. These are not ordinary runways, but ones from which drones can take off without a traditional airfield. Some of the sites were set up at existing military bases and airfields, while others were literally carved out in the middle of the countryside. And this, according to the investigation, is not just construction for backup. 7 out of the 10 facilities, as the publication discovered based on open-source tracking data, have already been used during Russia's recent attacks on Kyiv. In other words, these bases are already operational and Moscow continues to expand them. And now for the most interesting part, about 20 of the new launch rails have an increased length. Analysts suggest that this may indicate the preparation of sites for the launch of new, more powerful long-range drones. New launch positions are appearing at individual facilities, and at one of the bases, according to the Telegraph's assessment, more than 1,000 drones can be stored simultaneously. In other words, we are not talking about just a few individual devices. Moscow is creating infrastructure for the massive deployment of drones, and the more launch sites there are, the more drones Russia can potentially lift into the sky simultaneously. For Ukraine, this means yet another problem. Attacks could become larger in scale and launch directions more difficult to predict. But there is another factor: range. Russia is rapidly modernizing its version of the Iranian Shahed. Replacing the slower models are new variants that are supposed to be faster and have a longer range. Ukrainian government documents that have become publicly available mention new Gerans 4 and Gerans 5 modifications. According to data provided by the Telegraph, they can carry up to 90 kilograms of payload, and the range of the new variants is estimated at nearly 1,000 kilometers. And here, the map of Europe begins to look completely different. Because if such drones are launched from the appropriate Russian bases, Warsaw falls within their potential reach. It is about creating infrastructure that technically makes such strikes possible. And this is exactly what worries European military analysts the most. Because the main change is not just in the range. Russia is trying to make its drones more difficult to intercept. Speed, maneuverability, new navigation systems, and increased payload, all of this forces Ukraine to constantly adapt its air defense. And Russian drones, it seems, are evolving along with the war. Ukrainian military intelligence has also warned about the arming of certain Gerans UAVs with air-to-air missiles. In other words, the drone may no longer be just a cheap weapon for striking a building or infrastructure. They are trying to turn it into a more complex combat system. And this explains why investments are being made separately and simultaneously in both drone production and a network of launch sites. One of the main drone production sites is the Russian Special Economic Zone Alabuga in Tatarstan. It is precisely there that Moscow has deployed large-scale drone production. According to the Telegraph, the complex's facilities are capable of producing thousands of drones per year. But it is no longer just about separate production. Russia is building an entire infrastructure for the use of strike drones, from manufacturing and storage to transportation and launch. And this is no longer just one factory or one military airfield. It is about a network of facilities dispersed across the territory of Russia, which allows Moscow to simultaneously increase the number of launches and the scale of air attacks. It is this systematic approach, and not just the number of drones themselves, that makes the Russian drone program an increasingly serious military threat. On a map, distances look different when it comes not to tanks or planes, but to long-range drones. If Russia continues to increase the range of its vehicles and deploys them at new bases, part of NATO territory will end up within the zone of potential reach, and the ally closest to Russian military infrastructure is Poland. The Telegraph cites European and American intelligence officials who believe that Moscow is considering various scenarios for possible provocations on Polish territory. Among them are attacks on critical infrastructure with missiles or drones, as well as so-called false flag operations, where they attempt to shift responsibility for the attack onto another party. NATO is reacting to this publicly. A representative of the alliance told the Telegraph, NATO is ready to defend every inch of allied territory. And they add, the alliance continues to strengthen its deterrence and defense capabilities against any threats, including drones. And this is fundamental because drones have changed modern warfare. They are cheaper than missiles, they can be launched in mass, and they can be modernized. Most importantly, their quantity can compensate for even significant losses. That is precisely why Europe is now forced to think not only about tanks, fighter jets, and missiles, but also about what to use to shoot down thousands of drones. And in fact, Ukraine has already become a testing ground where this system is being put to the test. Russia is increasing the number of launches, changing routes, combining drones with missiles, modernizing the devices themselves, and simultaneously building new locations from which they can be launched. What is flying at Kyiv today could technologically become a weapon of much greater range tomorrow. That is precisely why the Ukrainian experience is currently being closely studied in NATO countries. Because the question is no longer just about how many drones Russia has. The question is how many it will be able to launch simultaneously and how far. Russia is effectively forming a new system of aerial warfare, at the center of which is the mass use of drones. On one hand, production facilities are capable of manufacturing thousands of drones, and on the other, there is an extensive network of bases, storage facilities, and launch sites. Between them lies a separate logistics system that ensures the movement and deployment of the drones. In parallel, Moscow is modernizing the weapons themselves, increasing flight range, speed, payload, and resistance to air defense systems. For Ukraine, this means a further increase in the scale and complexity of Russian air attacks. For NATO, it is a signal that the drone threat is no longer exclusively a Ukrainian problem. After all, with the increase in the range of Russian drones, the geography of the potential threat is expanding to the territory of alliance countries. And if previously the key question was how many drones Russia is capable of producing, now others are becoming increasingly important: where they are located, where they are launched from, and what distance they are capable of covering. What do you think? How far is Moscow prepared to go tomorrow? And will NATO have time to prepare for the new drone threat? Write your thoughts under this video. Take care of yourselves and see you in the next episodes.